Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. On 5th February, US President Donald Trump delivered his second State of the Union address. While the first part of his nearly 2-hour-long speech was grounded in his domestic agenda, including, and I quote, dangerous southern border and the wall, the second half was where he put across his foreign and security policies, dealing with China, Russia, North Korea, and also troop withdrawal from Syria and Afghanistan. He also defended his decision to go forward with a ballistic missile defense and opting out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement with Russia. Russian President Putin, for his part, has also stated that Moscow will opt out of the INF Treaty in the next 6 months. Trump also defended the decision to opt out of the Iran nuclear deal. To discuss whether Trump has a coordinated foreign policy outlook, we are joined today by David S.Sedney. S.Sedney was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia from 2009 to 13, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia 2007 to 2009. We are also joined by Seyed Mostafa, a journalist and analyst based in Tehran. Let me begin with S.Sedney here. S.Sedney, the INF Treaty, we know that the US assessed multiple times that Russia was not complying with the treaty. In fact, Russia has also said that it couldn't cap its capabilities given production of long-range missiles in the neighborhood, which implies China, ironically. But do you think the only way out was to withdraw?
I think at this point, the political support in the US, particularly in the US Senate treaty, had pretty much gone away. Not everyone, but a majority, because of these violations by Russia. The Russians, in many fora, the INF Treaty has groups that examine issues such as whether each side is complying. The Russians refused to provide the information, refused to discuss, refused to admit what we knew they were doing. Now, that is something that has actually gone back through the Obama administration, even into the Bush administration.
Correct.
So at this point, I think it made sense to withdraw, yes.
So there was the verification mechanism, and it was a pretty strict verification mechanism. Are you saying that the Russians, when they were in non-compliance, or they refused, they said, well, it's the US that is in non-compliance, but regardless of that, were the Russians saying that you cannot have on-site inspections?
The Russians were developing new capabilities that they said did not fall under the treaty. However, it was clear to us, to our experts, that those new capabilities did fall under the treaty. Now, there is a lot of speculation, as you said, that those capabilities were not just directed against us, but against China as well. And the issue relating to China is a very important one when we discuss the limits on this treaty. But the key issue here is the Russians were developing new capabilities that they would not disclose and which were not covered by the on-site inspections under the INF Treaty. They would have had to be expanded, and the Russians refused to expand them.
Okay, so now we are at a situation, once again, I would say it's a redux, with R&D going into BMD and withdrawal from the INF. So is this, a journey back to the 70s and 80s?
I wouldn't say it's a journey back to the 70s. I say it's a journey ahead to the 21st century, where it's not just the US and Russia that are the key actors. The ballistic missile defense issues don't involve just Russia. In fact, they're not primarily aimed at Russia. It's primarily concerns about countries such as North Korea and Iran, countries that may have small numbers of missiles, in the case of North Korea, already has nuclear weapons. In the case of Iran, may have nuclear weapons. And ballistic missile defense is really a requirement to defend against those. And then China, with its growing arsenal, poses a threat to the United States, to the region, and has to be countered both in terms of missile defense and in terms of additional offensive capability.
Well, S.Sedney, this is like the staple, talk, frankly, and you know that. We've attended lots of roundtables and conferences where this is presented as the reason. But frankly, you also know very well that there is a lot of criticism of the BMD in two ways. A, that it's a Maginot line in the sky, and B, that despite that, it actually destabilizes deterrence.
There are those criticisms, but the real problem with that kind of argument is it doesn't take into account the fact that the biggest threat to the United States and actually to our allies as well is the launch of a small number of missiles from North Korea, which is the biggest threat that it's aimed against. And then secondly, potentially Iran, which continues its missile development program, and the potential and others as well. Threats that the ballistic missile defense system can defend against reasonably well now, and with additional investment could do a much better job. So I think ballistic missile defense is definitely a requirement for the future. The impact that it has on the strategic balance among the United States, China, and the U.S. is something we do have to be concerned about. But I think those are issues that are handled much better through high-level strategic discussions rather than the issues of numbers and defensive mechanisms.
Okay, Sedney, before I go to Mustafa Khoshcheshm, let me ask you another thing. U.S. is so far the superpower, and it talks about threat levels from North Korea and from Iran. Incidentally, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from JCPOA, and we'll come to that. But I want you to give me a sense of how those who sit in Pyongyang or in Tehran would look at the threat level from the United States.
I think in both countries, it's very clear that the United States is not going to invade them. The United States has not attacked them. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, the armistice has been in place for over 40 years, getting close to 50 years now. The evidence is very clear.
No, but this is not about intentions, this is about capabilities. And the US capability, by far, is light years ahead of anything that North Korea or Iran can employ or deploy.
Of course, the United States has a great power, and Russia and China, and potentially other countries such as India, have much greater power than one individual small country. So the issue is not capability, the issue really is intention.
Okay, let me go to Mustafa Khoshcheshm here. Mustafa, you want to say something to the way Sedney has posited the idea of threat from Iran or North Korea?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, it was interesting to hear his words because, if in parts of his remarks, Mr. Sedney stated that Iran may have nuclear bombs, while we know that Iran has a nuclear deal in place. Iran has been complying with all its undertakings required by the international community. It's doing utmost transparency efforts under a very tight, somehow unique inspection regime in place by the IAEA. Iran, is under the surveillance of the IAEA cameras and IAEA inspectors. It has gone under the highest number of man-hour of inspections by IAEA, and there has never been any shred of evidence, found even by the National Intelligence Estimate of the United States since 2007 onward about Iran's, peaceful nuclear program. So very recently, even the intelligence estimates of the United States, they put question marks on Mr. Trump's words about Iran's threat. If here there is a state that has a nuclear bomb, it's the United States and its ally Israel in the same region. If there is a state that has ever dropped a nuclear bomb on another state, it's the United States. The U.S. has always been threatening Iran, both the U.S. and Israel. We do remember Mr. Obama, the former U.S. president, always stating that all options are on the table. They have been, they have never been shy of expressing their true intentions for military action. The fact that they are not doing so, according to Marshal Zinni, the former CENTCOM chief, is that they are not capable of, destroying Iran, and the costs are too high for the United States. Why? In the words of Marshal Zinni and many others, because of Iran's robust, that's quote unquote, robust missile program. We do know that Iran's missile program covers a range of less than 2,000 kilometers. So we are not talking about the United States territory. We are maximum talking about Israel and the U.S. Allies and bases in the same region, in our region. That has been playing as a strong deterrent, factor
okay, Mustafa,
in order to keep the
Mustafa,
U.S. and Israeli threat away.
Okay, Mustafa, here's the thing. In a State of the Union address, and I'm quoting from what Mr. Trump said, my administration has acted decisively to confront the world's leading state sponsor of terror, the radical regime in Iran. It is a radical regime. They do bad things. We know Mr. Trump is in the habit of repeating qualifiers. To ensure this corrupt dictatorship never acquires nuclear weapons, I withdrew the United States from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. But here's the thing, and this is something that I will take back to Sydney also. Mr. Trump and his administration officials are also on record as having said, and this is in response to criticism that Iran has been in compliance with JCPOA. They said, well, it's not just about the nuclear weapons. It is about the kind of power projection that Iran wants to do in the greater Middle East. And that is where the real thing lies, because Iran has a presence through its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, and that is essentially the kind of threat that Israel faces, and therefore there is this sort of joint strategy to put Iran in the doghouse. So this is the approach right now. I want to ask you, how do you think it squares with Mr. Trump's assertion that the U.S. also needs to get out of its long wars, including from Syria?
Well, first things first, I have a real problem with the words that are used by politicians in the West, especially when it comes to terrorism. The UN Security Council members, they have defined and enlisted a number of terrorist groups, and Iran is not present there, so its interpretation of terrorism is not considered in there. It has been defined by them themselves, yet they have placed 4 groups: the Taliban, ISIL, Jabhat al-Nusra, and or Daesh, and Al-Qaeda as terrorist groups, the only terrorist groups that have been enlisted by the UN Security Council. Okay, now who has created them? Who has fed them? In the words of former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, in an academic address, he acknowledged that the mess in the Middle East, in Syria and in Iraq, the terrorism that started in there, or the war of militancy, was to be blamed on Syria, Turkey, and Qatar. A week later, after pressures, he excused himself, but he never said that he was wrong originally. He just excused himself and asked for pardon because of revealing that. Michael Flynn, former Pentagon intelligence chief, who later became the national security advisor of Mr. Trump, he also stated that they were completely aware of the congregation of militants in western Iraq and eastern Syria, and they informed the White House, Mr. Obama, but they took no action, zilch. Okay. So I have so many other acknowledgements.
Okay, I know, but I have to go back. Yes, but I have to go back to Sydney here. Sydney, you heard what Mostafa is saying, and he's quoting from very senior U.S. officials, and he's also raising some very important questions with reference to both the capabilities and the intentions of the United States vis-a-vis Iran.
Well, first, let me say the main issue with the JCPOA was the fact that it was temporary, and while, yes, Iran has abided by the agreement in the short term, that's the problem with the agreement, is it doesn't cover the long term. All it did was pause Iran's nuclear progress. It didn't end it. That's the reason why not just President Trump, but many others in the U.S. opposed the JCPOA. It didn't stop the progress of Iran towards a nuclear weapon over the long term. And the fact that Iran continues to develop its missiles, the missiles it has, but more importantly, the missiles that it's building for the future, which will have much longer range than the ones that Mr. Mostafa says, clearly give Iran a greater capability. Ballistic missile defense against North Korea and Iran doesn't look at today. It doesn't look at tomorrow. It looks 5, 10, 15 years down the road. That's the threat we have to worry about. And then when you combine that...
But your European allies do not seem to agree with this assessment.
I think some of our European allies do agree with it. They thought it was the best deal they could get. We believe, I think many of us in the U.S. believe, that we should have done better. But even more importantly than that are the stated aims and intentions of the Iranian regime and its actions up until now. The actions in Syria. If Iran had not supported Bashar Assad, the regime in Iran would have changed a number of years ago, and then we would have avoided millions of deaths. Similarly, in Yemen, if Iran was not supporting the Houthis, there would have not been the war that is going on there now. The EU recently condemned assassinations ordered by the Iranian government in Europe. That is what is meant by a state sponsor of terrorism.
I'll go back to Mostafa on this, but I have to ask you this, Sedney. You are aware of the fact it's been reported very clearly now. Two events. One, the Israeli Mossad's assassination drive against to eliminate Iranian physicists and engineers. This is on record now. And secondly, the U.S.-Israeli attack on the Natanz facility with what came to be known as the Stuxnet virus. All of this is on the record now. So if that is what state-sponsored terrorism is, then would you also agree that what the Israelis tried to do with the Iranian nuclear community was also state-sponsored terrorism?
No, you're really talking about different things. The threat from Iran developing a nuclear weapon clearly for Israel is an existential threat. The leaders of Iran have said that they want to completely destroy and wipe Israel off the map. If Iran dropped its opposition to Israel and said that it was prepared to have Israel live in the neighborhood, recognize Israel diplomatically, treat Israel as a normal state, then that would not be an issue. But that's not what Iran's leaders have said. They said they wanted to destroy Israel. So the threat that Israel faces from Iran is very direct, very clear, and stated by Iran's top leaders. It is not something that is made up, and it's not something that's because of the United States. In the case of the assassinations in Europe, these were people who politically opposed the Iranian Regime.
But Maya Dagan, who was the Mossad chief, and before he fell out with Netanyahu, is also again on record as having said that both Netanyahu and Ehud Barak were really gung-ho about going to war with Iran. And he and other intelligence chiefs assessed that that was not the way to go about it. So clearly it's not just Iran thinking of attacking Israel. Israel has placed the war option on the table many a times.
Well, you have to go back to the core geostrategic, geopolitical issues. Israel is a state. Iran has said Israel should not exist. Israel and the United States are fully ready to recognize Iran and work with Iran as long as Iran is not trying to destroy other countries, as long as Iran is not trying to destroy other people. If Iran were to recognize Israel, send an ambassador there, treat Israel as a normal country, there would be no problem here.
Okay, I will take that to Mostafa, but before that, quickly. So two cases here. One is North Korea. And North Korea not only opted out of the NPT, but it went on, it tested the missiles, it tested its nuclear weapons, and it basically gave a fait accompli to the United States. So that's one case. And on that case, Mr. Trump, having once met Kim Jong-un, has now also again declared during the State of the Union address that he will be meeting him again, this time, and Feb in Vietnam. On the other hand, you have the other case, which is Iran, where the United States in combination with its European allies, the European Union and the United Nations, got into a multilateral agreement where Iran signed on the dotted line, and yet the US withdrew unilaterally from it. Now, what's the lesson here for other countries? Would they opt for what North Korea did, or would they opt for what Iran tried to do?
In the case of North Korea, what Kim Jong-un has said, and it still remains to be tested, is that North Korea is prepared for complete and irreversible denuclearization. There are a lot of doubts about that.
That's not what the North Koreans are not putting that construct. They're saying that denuclearization is about the entire Korean peninsula, which actually means the extended deterrence given by the US to South Korea also comes into that, according to the North Korean interpretation of that.
That is not part of what is on the table from the US side. As I said, there are a lot of doubts whether North Korea, in return for lifting of economic sanctions, will completely destroy not just its current, but its future ability to build.
Correct, I agree with that. But my question remains. Which lesson, if State X wants to take that route, it would look around and say, okay, here's North Korea, having given fait accompli where the US wants to go and talk to it, and here's Iran that tried to go into a deal where the US withdrew unilaterally from that deal. So what lesson is State X going to draw from this?
The unfortunate part about this is, you were right, the US withdrew from a deal, but it was such a flawed deal that it should not have been entered into in the first place. That is one of the problems when you have a controversial policy position in a country that's a democracy such as the US, where most of the people, or at least a very large majority of the people, think it's a bad deal. So yes, that's a problem with democracy. Democracies do change their minds, but the core geopolitical issue, which I look at as a strategist, is what are the long-term intentions? The long-term intentions of Iran clearly are hostile to its neighbors, such as Israel, and to others, such as the people in Yemen. That kind of hostility is something that underlies the concerns that the U.S. has about the future of Iran. If North Korea changes, then I think we will be able to have a degree. But I would stress again, the commitment of the North Koreans is still questionable, and we will have to find out what happens when this meeting takes place and future meetings between the U.S. and North Korea.
Okay. Mustafa, over to you.
Okay. First things first, in Yemen, there is a very tight siege. Even the UN vessels carrying food and humanitarian cargoes cannot go through because of the siege imposed by the Saudi-led coalition of 14 member states, as well as the UK and the US on sea and in the air. So there is no way that Iran could send missiles, 6 to 9 meters long to that country, or anything, any kind of weapon to there. In the case of Syria, if it hadn't been for Iran, now ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra, the official offshoot of Al-Qaeda, would have owned land and a country in there, the same terrorists that have been killing people in Europe, in Madrid, Nice, and Nantes, and London, and elsewhere. And I believe that the European nations should be thankful to Iran, at least for hunting down the same terrorists that have been killing people in Europe. And in the case of Israel, it's interesting to note that in the last 2 years, there have been a growing number of Israeli officials in the cabinet ministers, who have been threatening to wipe Iran off the map. That's very important to note, because Iran has not been threatening Israel, at least for some 8 years now, or 6 years, I'm sorry, for now. And they've been increasing their threats to Iran. They own around 200 to 400 nuclear missiles or nuclear warheads. They, have been threatening to invade Iran, and they now say that they are bombing Iranian, facilities in eastern Syria. Iran says it doesn't have any facility in there, but the Israelis insist that they are bombing Iran on the land of a third-party state. That's very important. So if there is anyone irresponsible here, escalating tensions, it's Israel and its supporters and allies. Iran is only, trying to do what all other nations do. If it were the United States and called by a friend, an ally from some other countries, would they not rush to its aid? Didn't they do so for Saudi Arabia when it was about to come under invasion by Saddam Hussein? Didn't they go to help Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait? Syrians, as well as the Kurds in northern Iraq, as well as the Baghdad government, they are Iranian allies or friends, and they called for Iran's military request. And Iran sent advisors, and in certain cases provided them with weapons in northern Iraq and in Iraq in order to fight the terrorists back. That's the only thing that has meaning, some good meaning in here, that shows that Iran, if there is any stability in the war against terrorism in the Middle East, Iran has the lion's share in here because it has been present on this scene. It has helped two nations fight the terrorists back. Now, the way that the United States is treating Iran with so much irresponsibility, supporting Israel that has had a hand in, as you mentioned,
but here's the thing, Mustafa, here's
Iranian.
the thing. There's a lot of criticism of Iran actions in Iraq also and in Syria also, especially in terms of the fact that the Syrian population wanted to have democratic elections. They wanted Bashar al-Assad to relinquish power, but he dug in. And also, of course, the fact that Iran has Hezbollah as its proxy, which is based in Lebanon. It's a parallel power within Lebanon. It is also providing help to Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So all of this, in terms of power projection, is something that Iran cannot really deny. There's empirical evidence of it.
Away from all the media propaganda, there has been an election in Syria. There have been 5
million people. There used to be elections in the Soviet Union also. Mustafa, there used to be elections in the Soviet Union also.
That's the only... Okay, let me explain that. That has been the only election in a country that has been, under war, actually, a war on terrorist groups. As soon as the terrorists are finished and annihilated, there could be another one, as the people of Syria and the government of Syria would like. This is their own decision. But as regards Iran, Iran has already hosted a number of meetings of opposition of the Syrian government alongside the Syrian government in Tehran at least 3 times. Iran has been trying to mediate between the two sides. Of course, the opposition that is not armed and that has not killed the citizens of Syria alongside Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL. So Iran has done its effort. Iran is present and one of the key actors in the Astana and Sochi talks alongside Russia and Turkey. Turkey is a supporter of the Free Syrian Army and many other militant groups in northern Syria. They are trying to write down a constitution, a new one for Syria. But Iran has already stressed that this is a call by the Syrian nation, finally. They should say if they want this government and the constitution or not. That's one thing. Now, with regard to Hezbollah, Hezbollah is not at all a proxy. Remember, it is an independent entity. It's a friend. It's an ally, but it's not a proxy force. They do what they want.
Well, it happens to be wherever Iranian interests are. So it must be a very close friend then, because it usually is present when Iranian interests are concerned.
That's called the meaning of allies, not just close friends, but allies, but not proxy force. Proxy is different, completely different. Okay. Now, if it hadn't been for Hezbollah, the Israelis would still be in Lebanon, in Beirut, southern Beirut, and they would not withdraw from the occupied territories. That has been the meaning of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has never invaded Israel. Okay. They have been defending their own territory.
Okay, Mustafa, I have to wrap up, but very quickly back to Sedney. Sedney, you said that the JCPOA was a flawed agreement. Fine. The US has withdrawn from it. Now, what is the option now outside of sanctions?
Well, sanctions have been imposed and are going to be strengthened. I think you would find that if Iran was interested in reopening negotiations with the Trump administration to have the kind of discussions that, for example, the North Koreans are having, I think that you would probably find the possibility of a real sustainable deal. But it would have to address those issues such as Iran's ballistic missile program, Iran's support for such as Bashar Assad, for destabilization.
That's a huge agenda. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Iranians have already made it very clear. They have already made it very clear.
Agenda, but that has to be on the table if you're going to have really effective talks.
Okay. Thank you so much. This David S.Sedney and Mustafa Khoshcheshm in Tehran talking to us about Trump's State of the Union address, issues relating to North Korea, Iran and Syria. We're going to take a short break and at the other end of the debate continue with our discussion of Mr. Trump's foreign and security policies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing President Trump's State of the Union address, specifically with reference to what he put forward in terms of his foreign and security policies. We are now joined by Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Associate Vice President of the Asia Center at the USIP. Welcome, Moeed. He talked about China, Russia, with reference to Russia, also the INF Treaty, opting out of the INF Treaty, the Middle East, which is Syria and Iraq, and also Iran and North Korea. So here's the thing, starting with the INF Treaty. He talked about the ballistic missile defense. So once again, going back to that, and of course withdrawing from the INF, saying, and of course, as you know, this has been going on for a very long time in terms of US assessments of what they said was Russia's non-compliance with the treaty in terms of some of the cruise missiles that Russia might have been developing. And now Putin has also said that in the next 6 months they will opt out of the treaty. Is this a redux, back to weapons R&D, back to BMD R&D, and of course the destabilization of deterrence itself?
To some extent, yes. I think what you're seeing is an unraveling of the Cold War agreement between the US and Soviet Union, which actually in some ways held deterrence together. And in an odd way, I don't think either side feels or perceives the kind of real threat that they did during the Cold War from each other. And that's made it easier, paradoxically, to pull out of such kind of treaties. You'd remember even in the Bush era, George W. Bush era, there was a conversation about America's nuclear weapon program needing sort of a reignition, if you will, maintenance issues, old arsenal, there was more R&D.
And also tactical nuclear weapons.
Exactly, tactical weapons, the conversation there. So I think this probably is not entirely new, but it's real. And once you pull out of a treaty like INF, I mean, you know the history and how long it took and how difficult it was to get where they got to. I don't think this is simply a bait and switch where you can pull out of it and come back to it if there's different leaders in the two countries. So this is real. I think this is going to have to become a new equilibrium, and I do think it weakens deterrence to some extent.
Okay, so let's put it in a broader framework. So there is now the space for Russia and the United States to, after having decided to opt out of the treaty, to go back to developing different types of missiles and also put a lot of money as far as the ballistic missile defense is concerned. Now, simultaneously, there's the North Korean problem where President Trump has said that he's going to meet with Kim Jong-un and Feb in Vietnam. That's on the one side. And secondly, the withdrawal from the JCPOA. Now, on the one hand, you're opening space for more R&D and development of different types of weapons and missiles. And on the other hand, you're trying to somehow ensure that other countries do not develop nuclear weapons and missiles. Is that going to work if the pace towards developing missiles and new nuclear warheads continues on the one hand, while you're trying to cap proliferation on the other?
Yeah, so look, I mean, my critique to this entire global nuclear disarmament debate has always been that the entire focus in terms of preventing countries from getting nuclear weapons is on the supply side. You know, the stronger powers come in and investigate, they monitor, they try and catch countries who break agreements, you try and find black markets and break them, etc. At the same time, global politics keep increasing the premium on acquiring nuclear weapons. The demand for nuclear weapons naturally keeps going up, because if you look at Libya, if you look at Iraq, the conclusion drawn by the North Koreans and Iranians and others is that if you have nuclear weapons, you survive, and if you don't, you'll be taken down. Right? And so if you look at the North Koreans negotiating and whatever comes out in terms of leaks of those negotiations, what you find is that they keep repeating Iraq and Libya over and over again to justify their nuclear weapons.
And so the tension increases.
In which you have supply side focus to prevent countries, but at the same time, you keep incentivizing them to get weapons to survive.
Correct. Give me a sense of what you think in terms of what President Trump said in relation to his foreign and security policies. And I ask this question because on the one hand, he talks about development and peace and says they cannot go hand in hand with long wars, and he wants to get out of Syria, and he's said he's talking to various groups in Afghanistan, including the Taliban. He didn't actually explain what other groups, but nonetheless that they are in talks and they won't get out of Afghanistan. But at the same time, his approach to Iran is completely different. So is there some kind of coordination here, or is it just piecemeal?
Neither. It's neither coordination nor piecemeal. I think this is a administration that, if you look at the track record of the past 2 years, they take issues in their own right and do not necessarily connect the dots. Okay. So it's not piecemeal. They have an approach to every country or every conflict, and that may be in contradiction to what else they may be doing elsewhere. So I think the connecting thread is difficult to create. Every country evokes a different kind of emotion, a different kind of response. And I think the common thread here is that the U.S. president has gone out and shown that he can defy conventional wisdom, establishment, international norms to do certain things. Nobody thought JCPOA will be killed. He did. Nobody thought he would ever reach out to North Korea. He did. Afghanistan, nobody thought, I mean, we used to argue in Pakistan all the time, oh, the US will never leave, this and that. And now everybody's worried that he may leave overnight. You know, so I think the common thread here is that he will defy and go against conventional wisdom for the most part.
But at the same time, after saying everything else, he said, well, if nothing works, as far as the US security is concerned, we will outspend them. So it does not seem as if he is very sure of what he is doing in terms of the consequences of it.
Or maybe he's the surest of all, because quite frankly, you know this craft more than most, nobody's ever sure.
Correct.
I mean, you've got a plan, and what he's suggesting, quite frankly, is I'm ultimately going to keep putting money into hard power, and because I'm way ahead of the world, nobody will be able to challenge me. And the other subtext here, which he didn't mention in the address, but you should internalize, is I'm not going to let another 9/11 happen, because I am going to tighten border security to the point that nobody will be able to come here and do anything. That's sort of the mindset that he's put out very publicly in the past 2 years, and I think there's some consistency in that, quite frankly.
Okay. That was Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Thank you so much for talking to us. We're now joined by Arnold, who writes on the history of Islamic thought and the politics and history of the modern Middle East and works at TRT World. Michael, thank you for joining us. We were talking about President Trump's State of the Union address, specifically with reference to his foreign and security policies as he put out in that address. Can you give me a sense of what you thought about it in terms of whether there is a coordinated approach here, or whether this is something where he's picking and choosing various challenges and addressing them according to the moment?
Well, I think with like a lot of things with Donald Trump, it's difficult to really say. I mean, he seems to be consistent in the moment in what he is saying, but when things change, he, as we all have come to be used to in the last couple of years, he very quickly adjusts his rhetoric and his speech to fit the moment. So I think it's hard to say whether there's anything sort of consistent here. I mean, it seems very clear that he is, at least in his rhetoric, trying to sound more presidential, as they say, than perhaps he has in the past. But beyond that, I'm not sure if anything is really that different here.
Okay, let me ask you about the Middle East. So on the one hand, he talks about the fact that long wars and peace and development do not go together. So he's talking about withdrawing from Syria. He's also talking about Afghanistan, where he said that his administration is in talks with several groups, including the Taliban. So that sounds fine. But then he withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, and his approach to Iran is fairly belligerent. So how does it square up? I mean, on the one hand, you want to get out of wars, and on the other hand, you are seemingly targeting a very important country on the basis that you feel that A, it's in violation of the agreement, and B, that it projects power in the greater Middle East, which is against the interests of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fair question, because these two things do, at least on the surface, contradict each other. On the one hand, you have a president who is saying that he wants to sort of withdraw American force from Afghanistan, from Syria, pull back from the region. On the other hand, seems pretty determined to confront Iran in one way or another. I think this reflects a number of sort of contradictions that exist in American politics. On the one hand, you do, I think, have Donald Trump and others who support him, who support a little bit more of an isolationist, American foreign policy. At the same time, clearly there are others, and there are other foreign countries who have significant lobbies in the United States, whether that be, of course, the Israeli lobby, or even those coming from certain Gulf states who are trying to push a particular agenda, primarily vis-a-vis Iran and Iranian actions in the region, and that can't be discounted. So I think there are tensions within American foreign policy in general, and perhaps because of Mr. Trump's more bellicose rhetoric, we see them play out maybe more apparently than they have in the past.
Okay, Michael, since you write on the Middle East and you observe the Middle East, give us a sense of what do you think is happening there. And so, for instance, which way Syria is going. Is this some kind of victory for Bashar al-Assad and his foreign allies, including Russia and Iran? Is it something which is likely to go the way of Ankara? Because clearly Turkey wants to also play a very important role in Syria and by extension in the greater Middle East. Which way is this going?
Well, I think first it seems to be clear that the one of the only points of agreement on Syria between at least the players who are major players there is their desire to have American forces withdraw, whether that be from Russia or from Iran or from Turkey, obviously the Syrian regime as well. They all have their own reasons for that, and so that's where maybe the agreement comes to an end. But there is an agreement on that point for sure. I think in terms of where it's going, it's very hard to say. I mean, there's very clearly that the Syrian regime has recovered a large degree of control. However, at the same time, that is also significantly dependent, particularly on Russia and to Iran to a lesser extent. Turkey has more specific concerns about securing its border areas, and that is its primary focus, whether that be against remnants of Daesh or ISIS, or of course now primarily against the YPG. So there's all these different interests at play here. Sometimes they converge on particular points, such as the desire to have American troops withdraw. But I mean, as we see now, after Trump's statement that he was going to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria within 90 days, I think it originally was, they've walked that back. And the U.S. Senate in particular has made it very clear that that is going to be a much slower timetable. So, on the one hand, we have rhetoric coming from the White House, which doesn't always match up with policy, of course, because they're not the only decision makers. And also, this president has a tendency to speak very publicly before things are set in stone.
Okay, so the general impression, looking at the Middle East, is that there's a power struggle between Tehran on the one hand and Riyadh on the other. And of course, there's a lot of empirical evidence of that also. And I say this without any value judgment in favor of either one or the other. But Turkey also has its legitimate interests, as President Erdogan put it in one of his op-eds in the New York Times. So is this like a triangular kind of power struggle? Do you think Ankara is important enough in this, or does Turkey's interests only relate to what's happening in Syria and not to other parts of the Middle East?
No, I mean, Turkey's interests very much relate to other parts of the Middle East. This was made very clear in the mid-2000s in the first round of the AK party governments here, where there was a return to sort of engagement with their more traditional sphere of influence in the Middle East. So there's no doubt that Turkey's interests in the region go beyond what's happening in Syria. In Syria, I think there is a particularly more narrow set of interests that they are focused on currently, which very much relates to security. But no, their interests for sure go beyond that. In terms of that dynamic and how it plays out between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think that's a bit more difficult to say. I mean, Turkey has been very careful to not involve itself in the same type of rhetoric that you see coming out of both Riyadh and Tehran, specifically as it relates to sectarian rhetoric, utilizing sort of these sectarian tensions to pursue political goals. Ankara has not engaged in that type of rhetoric whatsoever and has stayed clear of that. So I think Ankara and Turkey is another factor to play here, but they seem to be much more astute in how they go about playing the game, and ultimately their interests lie in a bit of a different area.
Thank you, Michael. Michael Arnold was talking to us. Is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.